Today I'd like to tell you about a place with a story that gives you a glimpse of a different time. A time when attention spans lasted longer than a TikTok. Back when schoolhouses weren't just for education. And instead of gadgets for entertainment, people went to community gatherings or enjoyed the town band. And when you needed something and they didn't have it at the general store, you didn't rely on Amazon. Instead, you'd reach out to family and friends for help. I know a lot of these aspects of the past fit many other historical communities, but for this video, I'm focusing on Lee Center. Today, a quiet village in upstate New York, sitting proudly north of Oneida County's center in the town of Lee. It has a story worth sharing, and in a lot of ways, admiring. There's just something about 19th century upstate New York that they had figured out, and we would be better for learning more about it. One of the first American settlers in the area of Lee was a Revolutionary War veteran named Roswell Fellows. He left behind his family at Fort Stanwix, which is in modern-day Rome, New York, temporarily, of course, and basically pointed due north and searched for his own piece of heaven in the freshly created American nation. He chose the fertile farmlands up by modern Elmer Hill Road, clearing the land and paving the way for future settlers. And so they came, with another group arriving nearby in 1790, led by the family of Essex Sheldon. They built a log cabin and braved the thick wilderness. More and more families came, and they would build sawmills and flour mills that became lifelines for a growing community. When Deacon Nathan Barlow blazed the first wagon path, things really got going. By 1792, a flood of settlers joined the growing community along the Mohawk River, making what would eventually be called the village of Delta a pioneer hotspot. Looking a little bit west, the exact arrival of the first settlers in what is now Lee Center isn't certain, but it was shortly after the settlement of Delta. Canada Creek flows through its whereabouts, making it a prime spot for settlement. In 1793, James Young made his mark by building a log cabin just south of Lee Center today, and was joined by his family the following year. Soon, Eunice Park, a widow, moved a bit to the west of this in 1795. Her sons, William and Abijah, would later buy land that would eventually become much of Lee Center. These groups were not alone, but unfortunately, many of the early settlers left few records, and so their tales will remain some of those historical mysteries. Nevertheless, the first schoolhouse in the area was known as the West Schoolhouse and was built in 1796. You can picture Elijah Blake, the first school teacher, having his hands full trying to teach kids from these pioneering families. The economy there began to take shape with help from people like John Hall and Smith Miller with sawmills along Canada Creek. The industrious Forfar brothers joined in with a grist mill in 1798, ensuring locals could grind their grain into flour. People just kept coming, such as successful businessman and Whig Party supporter James Eames, and hence the area was transforming from wild terrain into a flourishing American community. At this point, technically it was still the town of Western, but in 1811, the town of Lee was officially born, split from Western, which itself had been split from Steuben and Whitestown years earlier. Lee had enough residents and also enough ambition from advocates like James Young and Joshua Northrop to become its own entity. The name Lee was chosen as a nod to settlers who had migrated from Lee, Massachusetts. The very first town meeting was an exciting affair. Elections were held outdoors, because the West Schoolhouse hosting the event was too small to fit everyone. They got to work, and things were changing quick. The First Religious Society built a church on Marsh Road after having previously held services in the West Schoolhouse, and a bunch of institutions followed. You have the Harmony Library Association, founded in 1820, and books were plenty of entertainment back then. They didn't need Wi-Fi. In 1823, the town took on its current boundaries, with a portion being ceded to the town of Ansville. Ezra Hovey added another gristmill in Lee Center around this time, and the Park brothers opened the first store. In addition, even though the settlement dabbled in leather manufacturing as early as 1815, Asa Adams made it official with a tannery in 1830. The Stedman brothers joined the party with furniture shops, making sure that no log cabin went unfurnished. It was around this time that Lee Center's first post office opened, and Charles Stokes was the postmaster. It connected the village to the wider world, and the name Lee Center was chosen. Well, just look at a map, and you'll see why, as it sits in the middle of the town of Lee. As the village grew, its residents constructed more homes, roads, and community places, building a legacy that would stand the test of time. However, it was not the only community growing in the town. You have Brookfield, Elmer Hill, Hawkins Corner, Point Rock, Stokes Corner, West Branch, West Lee, the hamlet of Lee, and, of course, the village of Delta. With that said, Lee Center stood out as a main hub and hosted the town government. In 1833, a stone schoolhouse was built there, and it was just one of 17 schools in the town by 1845. This was the pre-Civil War era, and during this time, central New York was a beacon of abolitionist activity, with the Underground Railroad stretching through Lee Center and other areas, providing aid to escaped slaves on their way to Canada. This was an era before telephones or radio, so if you wanted to get your news, you could always go over to the local church where there were lively conversations and more. And you didn't drive over in a car because they weren't invented yet. You'd take a stroll. There was no need for a gym routine during this time because the daily lives of people were demanding enough. They walked all over the place, whether it was hauling grain or visiting family and friends. During the wintertime, if they were lucky enough, they could ride in a one-horse open sleigh. Dashing through the snow, oh, what fun it must have been to ride. Horses back then weren't merely companions. They were essential for many types of work, especially farming. And in this world, if your plow broke midfield, you'd make a quick stop over to the blacksmith on Main Street. At the end of the day, if there was still time left, I imagine these people kicked back and felt a deep satisfaction that us modern folk will never know. The arrival of the stagecoach on any given day was an event. Children would step aside to watch and wave as passengers and mail rolled through the town. 2 stagecoach lines connected Lee Center and Rome, with the mail route taking a scenic route detour through Stokes, Delta, and Ridge Mills. Jacob Ritter's stagecoach regularly stopped at the Lee Center Hotel, which was built in 1860, to drop off passengers and perhaps say hello. In 1869, a historic water system began, with the Lee Center Spring Water Company providing the community with piped water for decades to come. Then there was the Lee Center School in 1872 and Methodist Church 5 years after that. The Felshaw store on Main Street was another community favorite, offering greeting cards, candy, and other essentials. Clarence Dingman's bicycle shop was another local treasure at a time when cycling was new and all the rage. In the early 1900s, the Rome Waterworks began building the Kissinger Dam on Fish Creek, a feat of engineering that included a 5,500-foot tunnel dug through solid rock. The water line stretched across Lee, ensuring that by the following year, fresh water would flow into Rome. And speaking of water, big changes were happening in southeast Lee as the state was planning to flood the village of Delta as part of a new barge canal system. This would affect Lee Center in many ways, one of which involved my direct ancestors. As the village of Delta was being disassembled, many of the building parts were recycled to the surrounding settlements, including Lee, Rome, and Westernville. The Only and Floyd canning factory there was one of such structures, initially begun by two of my great-great-grandfathers in 1884. With the incoming flood, they moved operations to Lee Center, in part because they were anticipating a direct railroad route to Rome that, in the end, was never built. Regardless, the Lee Center canning factory dominated industry in the early 20th century, around the time that the post office updated the spelling of Lee Center to its current form. Naturally, the canning factory was not the only place in town. General stores like Carl Simon's, George B. Lincoln, and J. Hitchcock were popular, and the Lee Center Hotel continued to be a spot for weary travelers, although it started to be called the Bauman Hotel under new management. Tragedy struck in 1918 when the hotel burned down, and it was just one of several devastating fires. It was about time for a firefighting service, and so in 1931, the Lee Center Fire Company was established, housed in the former Dingman Bicycle Shop, which had also become Charles Lloyd's store after that. One of the first purchases of the fire company was a state-of-the-art 1933 fire truck. Not too bad, considering it was early in the Great Depression. And speaking of trucks, this was a time when the town was transitioning from the horse and buggy era to the dawn of the automobile. One of the biggest jobs was to replace the old wooden plank roads with something sturdier. Fred Weibel's team of horses moved stones for the job, and it was just one part of the overall impressive feat. Meanwhile, life at the Only and Floyd canning factory was bustling, and at its peak, the factory employed about 200 people. It was run by my grandfather, great-uncles, and other family, and its canned goods were sold in A&P stores and Loblaws, two staples of early 20th century shopping. There were plenty of other jobs in Lee Center during this time, such as one centering around sawmills, but the once busy tanneries of the countryside were beginning to disappear, just like the canning factory would in the early 70s. By that point, Lee's schools had merged into the Rome City School District, and there were many new buildings in Lee Center. You have St. Joseph's Church, and the Lee Center Fire Department got a modern fire station on the Stokes-Lee Center Road. On top of that, the town of Lee decided to form a water district, and soon the taps in Lee Center were officially flowing with water from the new district, bidding farewell to the long-standing Lee Center Spring Water Company. That about brings us to the modern era, and today Lee Center is a charming rural village that stands as a quiet tribute to its early settlers. Even in the wintertime, the legacy of its early pioneers lives on in its snowy fields and overall enduring spirit. To learn more, you might want to check out Lee Town Hall, where the town's history is being beautifully preserved right in Lee Center. In closing, after looking at this history, maybe we should all put the phone down. Try and embrace simplicity, and perhaps find joy in the slower pace of life that they were so familiar with way back in the day. Have a good one.